Good morning, everyone. It is March the 13th, 2023. This is Christine speaking again. Today I'd like to talk about some issues on the community policing and why I believe that that's the way that we need to go, and why we're pushing to get a community police station office down in the Byward Market, which would be ideal. As you're aware, I've had some bad experiences having been married to a police officer, but these are some of the better times and what I learned prior to my being married to him. Years ago, he was a beat officer, and before we were married, I had the opportunity. I used to sneak on the beat with him, and I used to learn a lot of things that way because he also felt at that time that I should understand what a police officer's job was and what he had to do. Now, these are some of the experiences that I've taken with me into my becoming a security guard as well after I separated from him, after our marriage broke up. But I'd like to explain the difference between community policing and our patrol officers. There is a difference. The community policing was set up to work strictly with the community, and it was to get to know the community. Being in Ottawa Housing, they came knocking on my door to get to know me, to give me information, which was wonderful. And then we have events down here in Lower Town as well as around the city where we can actually talk to some of these community officers, which is wonderful because of the information that they give us. But I'm going to start with giving a little bit of information on what it was like walking the beat many years ago with my first husband, the police officer. One of the things that I used to do was I used to walk and meet up with him. For an example, here was I'd run into another beat officer, and I was talking to him for a moment because he already knew that I was engaged to my police officer ex-husband at the time, and we were just standing there having a chat when we heard two women. All of a sudden, there was just a ruckus. They were screaming at one another. We looked over, and they were ready to take the brooms to one another. They had the straw brooms, and they were just ready to swing at one another. So, of course, he rushed over to see what the problem was. And it seems that there was only one clothesline in the backyard. And Mrs. Smith was upset with Mrs. Brown because Mrs. Brown had just had a baby and needed the clothesline. So they had to share this clothesline. And so the officer calmed them down, started talking, and said, well, what's the problem? Well, Mrs. Smith said, well, I have the clothesline this hour, and she wants it for the diapers. And, of course, back then, it was all cloth diapers, so they had to go on the line. And so Mrs. Brown was all upset because Mrs. Smith wanted it, and she needed to get diapers dry for the baby. So the officer calmed them down, and he said, well, I understand exactly how you feel. I'm a new father myself, and these diapers can be a big problem. My wife has to put them out on the line all the time, I can understand. But I think, can we come to some kind of a compromise here? And they're looking at each other, and he's saying, well, maybe we can switch hours around. When do you really need the clothesline, Mrs. Brown? And so she gave him the hours that she felt that she needed it to make sure that she had diapers for the baby. And then he looked at Mrs. Smith and said, Mrs. Smith, do you think you can compromise and give her these hours, and maybe we can arrange some other hours? And it worked out that, sure enough, she said, all of a sudden, he said to her too, was, the priority here should be the baby, not you two. And she's thinking, Mrs. Smith's thinking, you're absolutely right. The baby comes first. So she was willing to compromise on her hours, and it worked out just wonderfully great, because after that, Mrs. Smith was taking more interested in the new baby that Mrs. Brown had. So, it was like all of a sudden it was, well, Mrs. Brown, if you really need the clothesline, can you give me a heads up and let me know when you need the line? And I'll be very happy to let you have the line. So it worked out very well, and it was not a confrontation or anything. It was just some suggestions, and he just talked like an ordinary person, and then women realized, well, he was a young father. He suddenly realized, well, things sometimes have to be compromised. And a baby, there's a lot of compromises to be made. So that was one incident. Another incident I'd love to tell you about is coming around the corner. We heard where the pub was. This time I was walking with my ex-husband at that time, and all of a sudden we heard a ruckus, and it was at the pub. And sure enough, we go around the corner, and I've got something that I'm going to get up there because I have something I really wish to show you, that what happened. And because being in the hospital here, it was interesting because since my knee was out of commission, I was going to need a cane. So I said, well, I don't need to go buy one. I've already got one. And I'm going to show you this cane because this is part of the story, which is a very interesting story. And I'm going to have to turn this around for a moment. And this cane is an old wooden cane that they used to use many, many years ago. This is a cane I'm using now. This was my second husband's great uncle's cane. And as we came around the corner, what was, well, they used to call him Whiskey Charlie because he used to love to drink. So when my husband came around, I came around the corner, there was two officers already trying to calm him down, and he was taking this old cane and was swinging it at the officers. And so they're trying to calm him down, and they've got him backed up against the corner. My husband told me to go across the street. Of course, he didn't want me to get hurt, which was normal. He always put me aside, made sure that I was safely if he did have to encounter something. But, of course, Whiskey Charlie, he's drunk. And boy, is he drunk. And so all three of them are trying to calm him down, and they're trying to get around him, trying to get behind him. And all of a sudden, one of them said, well, I guess we better call the sergeant. He knows Whiskey Charlie for years. He's been on the beat for years with him. So they called up. Sure enough, the sergeant was working. He came down, and he looked at him, and the sergeant had known him for many, many years. And he said, well, Charlie, what's the problem today? And the sergeant knew him and said, well, I know you have problems, and I know you have trouble solving them. So why don't you and I just sit down and talk about it, and maybe we can come to some kind of a solution to your problems. So he just sat him down there, right on the sidewalk, and he talked to him, and whatever the problem was. You see, Charlie had a problem. It was not only did he love to drink, but when he had a problem and couldn't solve it, he just really hit the whiskey bottle. And so the sergeant just calmly talked to him and gave him some suggestions on how to solve the problem that he was dealing with. And after that, everything broke up and everything went very peaceful. So this is one of the couple of stories on just how it's really good to have the community officers, and that's what they do, is they talk to the community. They get to know the community. And that was one of the wonderful things about being on the beat many years ago. You had to walk the beat to get to know the people. For another example, my ex and the officers, we'll use Bank Street as an example, used to walk Bank Street, used to get to know all the shopkeepers, and would come in and talk to the customers. Everybody would get to know the officer. He'd get to know what was going on, or if the shopkeepers had a problem. He'd know immediately what the problem was, and then things would get solved that way. So this is what community is, and our officers really need to be walking the beat more. Now I'm going to give you another example of all the different things that I have learned about talking things out with the police officers doing this. And what I learned was, because as a security guard, I had an incident, and it was quite an incident. It was Christmas time, and we had the Santa Claus display was up, and one of our plumper guards was playing Santa Claus, and I was bringing up the children to him. Well, in this particular case, the Santa Claus display was right in front of the beer store, of all places to put it. But we had an incident where the priest and one of his former psychiatric patient were collecting money for St. Joseph Mission. So they were asking for change when they came out of the beer store. Next thing we knew, we had this gentleman who came in, and he was banned from the mall. He was about 6'6", and we were told by the police not to engage him if possible, call him right away, because this gentleman had managed to get drunk, and when he was drunk, he had put 6 of our male police officers in the hospital at the same time. So here we find ourselves, the priest is arguing, the other psychiatric patient's arguing with him, and because he's upset because they're asking him for change. And I'm looking and I'm going, oh boy. this is not good. I've got some toddlers waiting to, a lineup of toddlers waiting to get up to see Santa Claus. They're right there. If this starts into an all-out brawl, I've got toddlers in the way. So as being a security guard, we're told, call the police first, but we had a problem. Fortunately, one of the other male guards came along, and he was shorter than me. So it ended up, I turned around, I had to get the priest out of there because he was going after the priest, and the psychiatric patient was ready to go after this brute of a man. And I mean, he was big. He filled a doorway, the one that put 6 officers in the hospital. So I got the little boy that I knew from the mall, because our other guard was in having lunch at the restaurant, and I told him to go with the priest, go take the priest, go get to the other guard, go tell him it's a code red, which we had for this guy. This was our code for him when he came on the mall, and he knew what to do. So they went for him, and by the time they caught up with him, he had to make a phone call from the restaurant, because back in those days we did not have 911. Most of our officers were not in cars, and so when you had called up, you had to call directly to the police station at the time. So it took a while for the officers to get to us. So in the meantime, I'm back with this shorter guard, and we found ourselves, I scooted the children right up with Santa Claus. Santa Claus realized what was going on. He took the children on his lap, and then as he talked to them, then he made a human chain through the Santa Claus display and handed the children one at a time over to the parents and people that were on the other side of the small fence. And so the other security guard and I was talking to the psychiatric patient. I was back to back with my other male guard, who was shorter than me, who was trying to talk to this drunk person who had put the officers in the hospital. So there I am, and there he is, and I'm waiting for the punch in the back of the head because I am a little taller than he is. But we managed to calm everything down. He talked calmly to the gentleman, let's put it that way, who had put the officers in the hospital, and I was calming down this former psychiatric patient, and we managed to talk our way out of it, and that was the best way to do it. So by the time the priest and the other guard got back after calling the police, everything was settled. And so it was interesting because then we got the children away safely, so none of the children got hurt. But in this particular case, sometimes, even being a security guard, you have to step in. You have no choice. We had no choice at this point. We had small children in danger. And we could have had the whole entire Santa Claus display wiped out. So, and then by the time the police did finally show up, they said, where's the problem? And of course, the detective, knowing me, having been married to a police officer, where's the problem, Chris? And I said, well, we settled it. And he looked at me and said, what do you mean you settled it? This guy's put 6 of our officers in the hospital at the same time. You got it settled? And I said, yes, we did. We talked our way out of it. And he just looked at me, absolutely stunned. But that was one of the important things that I had actually learned from being married to a police officer. So this is where it would be very good to have our community officers down here in the Byward Market, talking to people, calming things down, getting to know people down here. And plus the fact, I think we do not have enough communication between our patrol officers, who seem to come in, and not all of our patrol officers, so I'm not saying all our patrol officers, I'm saying there are some of our patrol officers that come in here and are very confrontational, ready to go. And that's not a good sign, because that gets things riled up. Where years ago it was not being confrontational, it was to try and calm things down. But I think having a community police station down here would be a wonderful idea. It would be, and if we had more communication, like say in my situation of being in the hospital now, because they knew me, if they had information on me, knew I was a senior, knew I had a service dog, and that before when the patrol officers were called, if they could have called the community police station, community station down here, and got information on me, they would have handled it probably better. So I think that's where we have less communication. But this is the thing: if they have information on people who are in the community, who are special needs, who have dementia, whatever, if they have this, then it would be great. But I also think that there would be an opportunity that if we had a community station down here, We could also put in a mental health worker there, stationed there with them, as well as a social worker. So when things do start getting out of hand, they're there immediately on site. And these community officers are not stuck back in the Elgin Street Police Station. They need to be here on site to be of any help to us down here. So there's many advantages to having police officers down here, but it's the community officers. And I advocate very strongly for them because I've worked with them before with Hintonburg as well. When we had the prostitution issues arrived in Hintonburg many years ago. It was nice to have the community police station there because we could just walk in. You had a problem. Okay, well, I don't know how to answer it, the officer would say, but he would say, well, I'll call somebody at the station, see if they can help me, and come back a little later. I came back, and sure enough, they had an answer for me. So it was not confrontational. It was just being very civil, getting an answer to our questions, or having a problem within the community. It was so nice to be able to notify our officers that there is a problem, or how do we handle it? Or if we've got a neighbor, how do we handle it? So this is what I wanted to say today, and give a little bit of a brief update on why I believe community policing is so terribly important. And you'll probably hear more about community policing as I go. So further on future videos that I put up. So I appreciate the audience and thank you for listening. And again, I'm getting back on my feet, but I just wanted to let you know just how things are going. And this is what I really advocate for, is community policing. And I think we could work very well with community policing with better communication with our patrol officers, because things are not in balance here at all. This is what I'm seeing. And thank you very much, and we shall talk again another day. Bye-bye. Take care.